Friends, today is a really important and somber day, one where we in America acknowledge a particularly dark period in our history in the not so distant past. It's a day that all Americans should pay close attention to, but especially those of us who are interested in, who practice, and who teach the system of Reiki. So let's talk about it. Friends, welcome back to Heartscapes, where we're learning the system of Reiki to live lives that are rooted, spacious, connected, and that help us to remember ourselves. My name is Michaela. Welcome back. So today, February 19th, is the day that we in the US recognize the Japanese imprisonment during World War II, 80 years ago. This was a time in American history when our government and our citizens perpetrated some very unethical, some very unjust and horrible violations against citizens of this country. It's a time in our history that we can sometimes want to just overlook or to ignore or to say that was in the past. We don't need to pay attention to that. But as the saying goes, those who do not pay attention to history are doomed to repeat it. And so I think it's particularly important that we look at these things as they come up. And for those of us who are Western, non-Japanese practitioners of the system of Reiki, especially those of us who identify as white, this is an essential thing to incorporate into our understanding of our practice and into how we talk about it and perhaps even how we practice or teach it. So I want us to dive into that today. Even though this can be a challenging conversation, it's one that I will do imperfectly, but I'd rather be imperfect than to be complicit with things that harm other people. So we're going to talk about that today. And in this video, I'm going to do a few things. I want to provide a little bit of historical context for what it is I'm talking about. Want to talk about the relevance to the system of Reiki, the very intimate connections between this particular time in history and the system of Reiki as it is practiced in the West, and to offer some resources for how you can acknowledge this day of remembrance in your life and in your Reiki practice. Okay, let's get going. So first, a little bit of historical context. I'm a historian by training originally, and so I can go down some deep rabbit holes with history, but we're going to keep it to just some important, essential points to get ourselves oriented here. So, casting our mind back 80 years to the time of World War II, an era in world history and in US history that continues to impact our lives, our mindsets, our culture to this day in ways that I think most of us are not particularly aware of. So our story really begins in December of 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. At this time, the Japanese military bombed the military bases at Pearl Harbor in the occupied territory of Hawaii. And this precipitated the entry of the United States into World War II. A few months later, on February 19th of 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This executive order authorized the imprisonment of Japanese Americans and the stripping of their civil rights, the seizure of property, and wealth transfer from Japanese Americans to the US government and to profiteers who gobbled up property as quickly as they could. Now, I use the word imprisonment specifically. Oftentimes, you'll hear this period of time referred to as the Japanese internment. And this is one of those cases where language really matters. The words we use matter. Because internment is a specific type of imprisonment, specifically the imprisonment of enemy combatants, military who are captured on enemy soil and, are actively engaged in warfare. It's a military to military action that is allowed during times of war. But what we're talking about here in this Day of Remembrance, certainly that happened. But what we're talking about is the imprisonment of Japanese Americans, American citizens, 120,000 of which, men, women, and children, were ultimately imprisoned in various camps across the Western United States. These were folks, 2/3 of whom were born and raised right here in America, who had no direct ties to Japan, but the majority of whom were imprisoned right here on American soil in what can rightfully be called American concentration camps. And these families spent years, the years of the war, imprisoned while their land, their farms, their property were redistributed to other people. It is a great injustice. It's one that at the time was called a military necessity, but now, in retrospect, and as early as the 1970s, was acknowledged formally by the US government as an atrocity, in essence, a war crime against our own people. It's something that caused generational trauma within Japanese families that still plays out today, and one that represented a huge transfer of wealth from Japanese families, from immigrant families that, couldn't help but impact those families moving forward. And it's for that reason that at a certain point in the very recent past, there was a reparations bill passed that gave some financial relief. Certainly could not make up for all of it, but some financial relief to the survivors of that time. There is much more that could be said about the history of that time, about World War II and this particular chapter in the war. I'll put links down below to densho.org and to the National Japanese American Historical Society, which provides a wealth of information about not only this history, but Japanese American experience across a wide range of topics, if you want to dig in a little bit more. But let's talk about what this has to do with the system of Reiki. It has a lot to do with the system of Reiki, particularly our experience of it as Western people. Because as it turns out, the system of Reiki came from Japan into the gateway to the Western world, which was at the time Hawaii, which at the time was an occupied territory, not yet a state of the United States, but was under duress an occupied territory of the US. Just prior to World War II, our founder of Western Reiki, Hawayo Takata, had brought this system of practice back to her home in Hawaii. Takata was a Japanese American woman who was born and raised in Hawaii and who had sought medical treatment in Japan for some illness and had discovered the system of Reiki with who would become her mentor, Chijiro Hayashi. She had such a profound healing experience with working with Chijiro Hayashi's clinic that she immersed herself in it. She became a practitioner and ultimately was granted permission to come back to her home in Hawaii and to teach this practice here. And for a couple of years, her mentor, Hayashi, would travel back and forth from Japan to be with her community of students in Hawaii to help continue mentoring her and to grow this beautiful community of practitioners. And at that same time, this tension was brewing between many world powers, Japan and the United States, of course, being two of them. Hayashi himself was a military doctor, and so he was immersed in the military culture in Japan and was asked to spy on the U.S. Military bases in Hawaii because of this connection that he had with Takata. And rather than do that, rather than betray this community that he had helped to develop, he took his own life because unfortunately there weren't a lot of options available to him as a military officer. Hey friends, editing Michaela here, just popping in this resource, the book Women in Reiki, Lifetimes Dedicated to Healing in 1930s Japan and Today. This book details the lives of many of the women who were foundational to the development of the system of Reiki in Japan. And in the sections on Hawayo Takata and on Chie Hayashi, Chijiro Hayashi's wife, you get much more of an in-depth look at the story that I just told and the roles that these women played both in the development of Reiki and in the transition of Reiki into the West. So check it out and enjoy. So part of honoring this day of remembrance and this complicated history is acknowledging the very real lives of the people who brought the system of practice to us in the first place. to acknowledge the sacrifices that they made, and to acknowledge the changes that had to be made to the system of Reiki as a result of the xenophobic and frankly racist tensions that were permeating the United States at that time. It's really quite a miracle when you think about it that Reiki is here at all. And it truly is the special alchemy of the territory of Hawaii that allowed that to be so. Even though Hawaii was the site of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, it was also not a state and was a population that was almost entirely Asian American and Polynesian people, indigenous Hawaiians, but also very, very large communities of Japanese descended, Chinese descended, and other Asian descended peoples. And so there were so many Japanese descended people in Hawaii that it made no sense to create imprisonment camps in that space. There was, I think there was a quote from one of the Hawaiian officials that said you would have to lock up everybody. And so it was this really interesting and challenging combination of spaciousness and constriction that Hawaii Takata was under when it came to being a Japanese woman, teaching a Japanese healing art during this time. I deeply admire what must have been great tenacity on the part of Hawaii Takata and great love and respect between her and her mentor, Chijiro Hayashi, for these events to have occurred. And we owe a debt of gratitude to both of these teachers for their ingenuity, their tenacity, and their willingness to persevere under these conditions. But one of the ways in which that perseverance had to occur is that changes had to be made to the system of Reiki. It had to become more palatable, more understandable, more accessible to a U.S. audience if it was to survive. And so the deep foundation of Japanese Buddhism and Japanese indigenous Shinto practice that is the foundation of the system of Reiki, that is the soil from which this practice grew in Japan, had to be stripped, had to be removed, really from the way in which the system was taught and practiced and discussed. There was even a certain Christianization that was done over the years. All of these things, again, were done to make this system acceptable, palatable to a U.S. audience. And honestly, this is what oppressed people have done forever. When their culture, when their language, when their spirituality and their traditions are under threat, or become a threat to an occupying power, they cloak it, they hide it, they conceal parts of it and reveal the parts that are acceptable or that can be appropriated by that dominant culture. And that's exactly what happened here. And as a result, the system of Reiki persisted in Hawaii and over to mainland US. And of course, we have a very robust system of practice now in the US, in Europe, all over the world. The system of Reiki is practiced. But it's significant to note that the system that is practiced and the wide range of systems that have grown out of that Western form is in many ways an entirely different form of practice than the original form. That by having to cloak these essential elements of the system of Reiki, it became very easy for Reiki to essentially become a kind of a blank slate that anything could be layered on top of. And so we have forms of Reiki that blend many, many, many different cultural traditions together without a lot of nuanced understanding about the difference between these systems and why they might come together, and the fact that much of it is not actually from the origins of Reiki itself. So that kind of brings us to, well, what should our orientation to all of this be as people who are curious about Reiki, people who practice Reiki either privately for ourselves or professionally with other people, and in particular for those who teach the system of Reiki? How can we hold all of this history, all of this nuance? How can we honor the systems of practice that have developed in the intervening 80 years since the system came into this country? But also honor the origins of the system, honor the history of the people that brought the system here, and honor their sacrifices. Again, Chijiro Hayashi took his own life to protect the community of Reiki practitioners that he had helped to develop in Hawaii. We, as modern Western practitioners of the system of Reiki, owe him a great debt of gratitude, of honoring, and of integrity. If you've watched this channel, you've probably heard me talk about integrity before. This is something I'm really passionate about. The part of the premise of this channel is to share the system of Reiki as much as I can as a Western white woman living in the United States in 2024, as much as I can, share the origins of this practice as I understand it through my study and my practice from its origins. To me, this really, really matters. And I believe it matters to all of us as practitioners. So where does that leave us? Let's talk a little bit about kind of how we can honor these perspectives, bring them into our practice, and kind of bring them alongside whatever it is that our practice looks like. Each of us is going to answer this question differently. So what I'm sharing is how I have come to navigate this, how others close to me have come to navigate this. But we are creative and flexible beings. There are many ways to shape our lives and our practices in ways that integrate complexity, right? And what we're dealing with here is a lot of complexity. So I invite you to just take in this perspective, these suggestions, and feel into how you might make it your own. If you have questions about that, I'd love to be in dialogue with you. So feel free to drop them in the chat or to reach out to me by email. So for me, the way that I have answered this call to be in greater integrity with my Reiki practice, it began with education. There was a certain point in my Reiki practice, about 3 years into studying with my first teacher, when I couldn't ignore any longer the fact that I knew this was a practice that came out of Japan, but what I was learning did not give me almost any context for what that meant. I knew that we were studying things like chakras, there was things like angels discussed and spirit guides, and that none of this was specifically Japanese. And I was beginning to feel really frustrated with that lack of knowledge that I had. I had not built that knowledge, and I wasn't being taught it through my studies. And so this really became a point of frustration for me. And ultimately, it led me to changing to a new teacher and to really beginning to study the history of Reiki from its origins as much as I could. And that dramatically shifted my practice. I shifted my practice to, as much as possible, practicing from those origins. Number one, because it felt more effective. It became a more effective way to engage the practice. But significantly, it also became a way for me to feel more in integrity with this history that I'm discussing, with the power dynamics that are involved with a history such as this. Now, I am not saying that every Reiki practitioner needs to dramatically change their practice, dramatically change the way that they think about the system of Reiki and practice it. Not at all. But I am suggesting that it is very important, essential even, for you to know the differences between the Western forms of Reiki and its original forms. As I said before, essentially we're talking about two different systems of practice, one of which was developed in a very specific cultural time and historical moment by a particular person who had a very specific spiritual history and knowledge and education, and a system of practice that was built on a very mysterious foundation of a practice that had to be scrubbed of much of that history and context. And again, became this kind of open slate where people could layer on many different forms of spiritual practice and stir it all up in that melting pot that we love to brew here in America. And, essentially call a wide range of practices Reiki that don't really have anything to do with the original form of Reiki. Now, I personally have the view that if we're not actually practicing the system of Reiki as it was originally designed, then maybe we should call our practice something different. Because the word Reiki, again, is a very specific word that came from a specific language, a specific culture. It means specific things in that culture that are different than the things that it means in Western Reiki. So my personal view is that systems of practice that have been dramatically changed from that original form perhaps should be called something different. But I know that that is a very impractical solution, and that is not likely to happen. So the next best thing for me is for those of us who practice to understand the distinctions, to understand the differences. And these differences are vast. There are differences in structure. The structure of the elements of the system of Reiki and the specific practices inside those elements are different from one system to the other. Significant differences in mindset. What is actually perceived and understood to be happening? What Reiki is perceived to be? What attunement is perceived to be? What the mechanisms for sharing Reiki with other people are meant to be. Even the fact that the system of Reiki is essentially, from its origins, a self-practice that then gets extended to practicing with other people is the opposite of what it tends to be looked at in the West, where it's essentially a healing practice for others that also benefits ourselves. So significant differences in structure, in mindset, in beliefs, and of course in what is actually included in the system. So these are important things to know, and it's information that is actually much more widely available now. Just in the last 15, 20 years, an incredible amount of information has been made available. Now, there's a lot of conflicting information because this is, again, reclaiming a history that was intentionally scrubbed, that was intentionally made obscure. It was intentionally cloaked out of necessity. Okay, out of absolute necessity, these elements of Japanese culture and spirituality were cloaked from the system of Reiki. And so it can be very hard to reveal, to uncloak these things, especially when those origins are kept fairly tightly close to the vest by practitioners back in Japan. But people have done that work. There is quite a bit of information available, including books by Franz Stina and Bronwyn Logan, books by Nicholas Pearson, by Hiroshi Doi, and others who share this perspective and give us a really solid education on what Japanese Reiki means. So learning those things, very, very important, and not very hard to do, accessible. You can continue watching this channel. I talk about it all the time. That's why this channel exists. And then from there, from that basis of education and knowledge, I really invite you to ask yourself, what might it look like to put some of these things in practice, to try them out, to, just experiment a little bit with practicing the one system versus practicing the other. You might find that the Western form of Reiki that you may have trained in originally or that you may have encountered from other people truly does suit you the best. It really is the best thing that's aligned with your mindsets, with your goals, with your beliefs, with your experiences. And that is fine. That's perfectly fine. You should be in the practice that best suits you and your spiritual development. And keep perspective on what that practice is and where it came from and where it didn't come from. Be aware that Western forms of Reiki frequently blend many different traditions together without any context for where those traditions came from and why they were brought together in this practice. But all of that can be untangled, right? You can learn those origins, and you will be a stronger practitioner, a more fluent practitioner, a more responsive and, dare I say, effective practitioner if you can articulate well for yourself and to other people the specific origins of the elements that you practice. And it's really fun learning those things. So those are the first two things, and probably the strongest, right? Really seek out that education, that knowledge, and then really explore for yourself what system works best for you, and then communicate that clearly to the people that you talk about Reiki with. From there are many ways that you can engage with Japanese Americans, Japanese culture now, that you can acknowledge this history. Even again, talking about it, acknowledging this day, acknowledging the connections between this particular history and the system of Reiki. Again, it's just absolutely intertwined. Reiki coming into the United States and the Japanese imprisonment experience are happening at the exact same time. In the exact same places. So I really would encourage you to look in your area, see if you have a chapter of the National Japanese American Historical Society or Japanese cultural centers, Buddhist temples, places that you can respectfully and humbly engage and learn. Taking care to respect the boundaries of those spaces and how they want to be engaged. But there are certainly many cultural centers and places that very much want to be in relationship with you around these topics and to be a resource to you in your practice and in your life. And from there, you can feel into what feels right to you as far as honoring this history as a Reiki person in the West, in the United States. That is a journey that is wide open. There are many, many different ways to engage, to be responsive, and to be in good integrity with your practice. If you want to talk about that more, if you want to brainstorm other ideas or just kind of share your perspective on what comes up for you when you think about this topic, I really welcome that conversation. I think it's so important for us to be willing and able to discuss these things, even if we do it imperfectly, which we will, I will. Sometimes that fear of, making a mistake or saying something wrong or not knowing something, of doing it imperfectly, can prevent us from doing it at all. And I really want us to push back against that. We don't have to be perfect. We do have to be willing and curious and open and, have that feeling in our heart that we want to be the best that we can be, to be in the best relationship that we can be with the practices that matter to us. At its essence, what I experience the system of Reiki to be is to be a system of healing through relationship. It's right there in the precepts, the foundation of the system of Reiki. All of those precepts that describe the way in which we should attempt to orient our heart and our mind and our actions, the way that we can think about the world, and that describe the outcomes of practicing the system of Reiki. They all have to do with relationships, beginning with our relationship with ourself, right? That just for today, we're unattached to fear and to anger. Our relationship with our life and with the world around us. Just for today, I am grateful for all of the connections in my life. Being in integrity with each other. Just for today, I am compassionate for myself and for all others. And being in integrity with the land, with nature, with the spaces that we occupy. The system of Reiki is so much about healing through relationship. It's about many things. There's many ways that we can think about healing within the system of Reiki, but I definitely experience that central to that is healing through relationship. And that includes our relationship to history, our relationship to culture, our relationship to the trajectory of the coming of this practice into our lives through the complex history of this time. And so I encourage you to build and deepen your relationship with these themes, with these topics, to deepen your relationship with your practice and with yourself by spending a little bit of time on this topic. And if you want to share what comes up for you around that, what you learn, experiences that you've had, resources that you have to help others to do this work, I please encourage you to share that down below in the comments. And I will put some links down below for resources where you can get more information on all of this. And so as you move along your journey of learning, of experience, of coming into good, deep relationship with your practice and with the history of this practice, may you be deeply provisioned for that journey. Thanks so much for coming on this conversation with me. I appreciate you so much. And until next time, I love you. Goodbye.